Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Hindwara. I'm here today with Dr. Alex Manjarian. So during the last session, we talked about cingulate cortex. We divided the cingulate cortex into three different areas. So this is just a brief revision before we delve into subgenial anterior cingulate cortex and the top-down cognitive control of emotions. So if you look at the section or the brain here, the MRI, the pointer points to the corpus callosum, which is a white matter tract that connects the two hemispheres of the brain to each other. And this is how the two hemispheres of the brain communicate with each other. The anterior part of the corpus callosum is called as genu because it looks like a knee, Knee. And the posterior part of the corpus callosum is called the splenium. Just above the corpus callosum is the cingulate cortex, and the pointer is pointing towards it. And there are three different slides here. The cingulate cortex is divided into three different parts. The posterior one-third is called as the posterior cingulate cortex. The middle one-third is called the middle cingulate cortex. And the anterior one-third is called as the anterior cingulate cortex. During the last session, we talked about the function of all the three parts of the cingulate cortex. Today, we are going to focus on the anterior cingulate cortex. We are going to divide it into three different parts, and then we will talk about the top-down control. We are also going to talk about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex briefly. I'm just going to show you the MRI picture where the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is located, and we'll also actually go through the location of amygdala in the MRI and how the subgenial anterior cingulate cortex controls the functioning or modulates the functioning of amygdala. Perfect. So now we talked about where the anterior cingulate cortex is located on the MRI of the brain. This is another MRI of the brain. There are three different sections, three different views, not sections. So this is the axial view, follow the pointer. This is the part of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is the sagittal view. This is where the prefrontal or dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is located. And this is the coronal view where the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is located. We'll talk about dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in detail some other session. But in short, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex plays a very important role, especially in working memory, abstraction, set shifting, task setting. So it basically controls the cognitive flexibility. Plus, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is also responsible for cognitive reappraisal. So cognitive reappraisal basically means that the way we cope with an emotionally stressful situation in a way to decrease the excessive physiological response or exaggerated response to an emotionally salient stimuli so that our behavior is contextually appropriate and socially acceptable, right? So that's a function of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's responsible for the top-down control. And Alex is going to talk during his session that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a part of your central executive network. Let's talk about now. This is the three views of the in the MRI, and I'm going to actually focus on the amygdala and the hippocampus. This is just to actually make our viewers accustomed to knowing where exactly these structures are located when they're looking at an MRI brain. So the first one is the axial section. So the green one is the amygdala, and the pink one is the hippocampus. So the best way to locate them is when you're looking at a section, if you see this midbrain, which looks like a Mickey Mouse, and right next to it, you have the uncus in the temporal lobe, and that's where the amygdala is located. And just lateral to the midbrain is your hippocampus. The next view is the sagittal section. This is the anterior part of the brain, posterior part of the brain. You know it's the posterior part of the brain. Look at the cerebellum. The green structure is the amygdala that lies just dorsal to the anterior tip of the hippocampus. Then we have the coronal section. where you see the amygdala in green here. So amygdala is located on the anterior tip. So now we know where the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is located, where the anterior cingulate cortex is located, and where the amygdala and the hippocampus is located. So we are going to focus on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the amygdala, and talk about the top-down cognitive control of emotions. Now let's talk about how these areas of the brain interact with each other. So we have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which we mentioned is a part of the central executive network. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is responsible for the top-down control of your anterior cingulate cortex. And as we said, the anterior cingulate cortex is divided into three parts. You have the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex that sends glutaminergic connection controlling the pre-genial anterior cingulate cortex, which in turn controls the subgenial anterior cingulate cortex. Where are these areas located? So when we looked at the MRI brain, we saw the corpus callosum, which looks almost like this, right? And the anterior 1/3 of the cingulate cortex is called as the anterior cingulate cortex, which is in red here. The anterior cingulate cortex is divided into three parts. And we just mentioned about it, right? Right here. So the part of the corpus callosum that is anteriorly is called as the genu because it bends like a knee. So the part of the anterior cingulate cortex that is right above the corpus callosum is the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. It's right here. And the part of the anterior cingulate cortex that is right in front of the genu of the corpus callosum is the pregenial anterior cingulate cortex, which is in blue. And the part of the anterior cingulate cortex that is underneath the genu of the corpus callosum, which is in green, is called as the subgenial anterior cingulate cortex. It's very easy to understand it. Just look at the positions. So what happens is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex puts a top-down control over the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which in turn sends glutaminergic projection to the pregenial anterior cingulate cortex, which in turn modulates the functioning of the subgenial anterior cingulate cortex. If you want to follow this in a little bit of detail, then what the pregenial anterior cingulate cortex does is that it's going to send glutaminergic projection to the GABA interneurons in the subgenial anterior cingulate cortex, which in turn modulates the pyramidal neuron firing of the subgenial anterior cingulate cortex. So this is the pyramidal neuron that belongs to the subgenial anterior cingulate cortex. This in turn modulates the functioning of an area of the amygdala, which is called as the intercalated cells. So now we are going to focus on what does this intercalated cells do. Now, when we talk about the GABA interneurons in the subgenial anterior cingulate cortex, GABA interneuron doesn't mean that it's putting a brake on these pyramidal neurons. What the GABA interneurons usually do is they modulate the functioning of these pyramidal neurons. For example, if there's no GABA interneurons and you just have the pyramidal neurons, then what happens is that the firing of these pyramidal neurons will be very asynchronous. And asynchronous firing of the pyramidal neurons is not good, right? It's also actually called as out of rhythm. So usually the prefrontal cortex generates something actually called as gamma oscillation. Now, gamma oscillation happens when the pyramidal neurons fire in synchrony. And gamma oscillation is required for normal perception as well as cognition. So we want all the pyramidal neurons to fire in a very synchronous manner. So that's a function of these GABA interneurons. And there are a bunch of GABA interneurons in the prefrontal cortex. We are not going to talk about it, but I just want the audience to understand that the function of the GABA interneurons is to fine tune the firing. So the pyramidal neurons that are firing asynchronously over a period of time, all of them will start firing synchronously to generate a very smooth firing of the pyramidal neurons and the release of glutamate. And the function of the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex is to modulate the functioning of the intercalated cells in the amygdala, which in turn is responsible for the anxiolytic response or the top-down control. We're going to talk about this in detail. So now we know where the intercalated cells are located. So they are in the amygdala. So we have subgenual anterior cingulate cortex that modulates the functioning of the intercalated cells. So the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, through polysynaptic mechanism, is controlled by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as well as the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, all right? And the GABA interneurons, we know what the function is. We're going to talk about different GABA interneurons and the function when we talk about schizophrenia. That is where the GABA interneurons plays an important role. They also play an important role in patients with depression, especially the somatostatin GABA interneurons, whose function is decreased by approximately 33%. We'll talk about it. Now let's focus on the intercalated cells. So what the intercalated cells will do is they will put a brake on the amygdala, on the centromedial nucleus of the amygdala. So if you look at the intercalated cells, what it does is that it puts a brake, so negative means brake, on the centromedial nucleus of the amygdala. The centromedial nucleus of the amygdala is the one that projects into the hypothalamus. And as we know, the hypothalamus is responsible for controlling the neuroendocrine system as well as the autonomic nervous system. It also projects to the periaqueductal gray. This is an area that is present in the midbrain around the cerebral aqueduct, which is the narrowest part of the ventricular system connecting the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So the gray matter that is present around the cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain is called periaqueductal gray. Plays a very important role in different functions, but one of its very important function is the fight or the flight response that you see under threat. It also projects, centromedial also projects into the locus ceruleus, which is the brainstem nuclei responsible for release of norepinephrine. So thus the centromedial nucleus or the amygdala during an anxiety response is responsible for the neuroendocrine and the autonomic response, the fight and the flight response, and the anxiety-provoking response of norepinephrine. So as we see here, the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, through the intercalated cell, is able to put a brake on the amygdala, preventing exaggerated physiological response or behavioral response, both physiological and behavioral response, to an emotionally salient or an emotionally arousing situation. What happens under stressful situation? Now, under stressful situation, if we consider this to be the intercalated cell right here, this is just for the simplicity, okay? This is now how it looks. So under stress, what happens is you have the dopaminergic center in your midbrain, which is called ventral tegmental area, which is ventral tegmental area. This is a source of dopamine, which controls the limbic system. So the ventral tegmental area, we're going to talk about this again and again and again. It sends projection to your prefrontal cortex, which is called as the mesocortical pathway. Meso means the midbrain. That is where the ventral tegmental area is located. It sends dopaminergic projection to the prefrontal cortex, which is called the mesocortical pathway, which is responsible for the cognitive control. It also sends a projection to your limbic system, And the projection that goes to the limbic system is called as the mesolimbic pathway. And we're going to talk about the mesolimbic pathway in detail when we talk about schizophrenia. And amygdala is a part of your limbic system. So what the ventral tegmental area does is that it sends dopaminergic projection to the amygdala. And the function is, when it's stimulated, it will release dopamine, right? Where does dopamine act? Dopamine will act on the D1 dopamine receptors located on the intercalated cells. What triggers the release of these dopamine? The trigger for the release of dopamine is CRF, corticotropin releasing factor, that is released from the paraventricular nucleus, which we call as PVN, of the hypothalamus. CRF is a very important endogenous anxiogenic compound that is secreted by the brain. It'll act on the CRF receptors on the dopaminergic neuron, causing the release of dopamine under stressful situation, because CRF is released whenever there's too much stress. Similarly, the dopamine neurons are also rich in alpha-2 adrenergic receptors. These are autoreceptors. What is autoreceptor? Autoreceptors are, so when you stimulate an autoreceptor, let's say alpha-2, when you stimulate it, what it will do is that either it will decrease the firing of the neuron if they are present on the soma or the somatodendritic region, cell body, or they can decrease the release of the neurotransmitter when they're present on the terminal. On the other hand, when you inhibit them, they will increase the firing of the neuron if they're present on the somatodendritic region, or they can basically increase the release of the neurotransmitter when they're present on the terminal. Those are autoreceptors, all right? Most of them are coupled to GI protein. These are G protein coupled receptors. So under a stressful situation, what happens is that there's a downregulation of the alpha-2 adrenoreceptors. That means that you release the brake from the dopaminergic neuron. So under stress, because of these mechanisms, there's increased release of dopamine. The dopamine will then bind to the D1 receptors on the intercalated cells, which is actually right here, right? So these are intercalated cells here. What it does is that when it binds to the D1 receptor, it usually inhibits or decreases the firing of these intercalated cells or the activation of the intercalated cells. So what happens when you decrease the activation of the intercalated cells under stress? This inhibition is lost. So now your centromedial nucleus of the amygdala is no more inhibited by the intercalated cells. So under stressful situation, this is how the disconnection happens between the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex and the amygdala. So under stressful situation, when we talk about the top-down loss of control, this is what we mean. Under stressful situation, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex through the subgenual anticingulate cortex is not able to put a brake on the amygdala, and the amygdala becomes hyperactive, which leads to emotional hyperreactivity or exaggerated physiological and behavioral response to an emotionally salient or stressful stimuli.